are back, and we are joined now by Regina Kunzel, professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale University, author of In the Shadow of Diagnosis, Psychiatric Power and Queer Life. Regina, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, perhaps it's helpful to start here with how psychiatry came to be in and of itself and integrate into healthcare, outside of kind of being, professionals or people that work in asylums or state-run facilities, as you talk about. In the 20th century, how did psychiatry become a part of medical care?
So psychiatrists, as you mentioned, it's a field that starts taking shape in the 19th century, and most psychiatrists at that point are working in asylums. They're doing sort of custodial care of people who are chronically mentally ill or people with dementia. They're really battling for their own professional legitimacy. They're worried they're not taken seriously as doctors. And increasingly into the 20th century, they start making their main business is not severe mental illness, but rather is what they call problems in living. And so they cast their net very broadly to capture, again, not just mental illness, but what they might think of as the sane but not entirely normal, and that lets them cast quite a wide net in there and to really expand their ambitions.
And that wide net that you described, what were some of the other categories that they dragged into that net in terms of deeming someone either delinquent or mentally ill?
Well, in some ways it would be very familiar to us now, so people with troubled marriages, people who are depressed, people who are anxious, and they, psychiatrists really make the case that they are the experts to go to for these just basic problems in living. Of course, among those claims that they make are that they're the experts of over the problems posed by homosexuality and gender nonconformity. And so those are among the things that they say they can treat and cure.
And how did they center conversion in their conception of care, and how relevant and enduring is that today?
So this is a really novel claim that American psychiatrists start to make around 1940. It requires them to revise the claims made by Sigmund Freud. Freud had theorized homosexuality as really a normal stage of development that everyone would go through. Ideally for Freud, passing through that stage to mature heterosexuality. But he also thought that there was something that he called universal human bisexuality, by which he meant a kind of mixed sex constitution where we all have elements of masculinity and femininity. And that was another way that Freud had of explaining homosexuality. And American psychiatrists around 1940 start really rejecting those ideas and revising Freud. And revising him to make the point that homosexuality is indeed a mental disorder and one that they could treat and cure. And they are very good at getting the word out about that idea, that claim. And so, this is something that certainly fills the published work of psychiatrists in this period, but it expands beyond to be a much more sort of popular idea in the broader culture. It's picked up by advice columnists, by popular writers, psychiatrists are writing popular books themselves. And so it's a very widely accepted idea in this period.
We are back with Regina here, and we have her on the phone, so hopefully we'll be able to hear responses here. So I was asking, what were the different iterations of the DSM? How was it important to categorizing homosexuality or gender nonconformity in this way during this period?
Right, so the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, which is the main organization of the field. It's a kind of catalog of mental disorders. Some refer to it as psychiatry's Bible. And it really functions as a kind of definitive list of what psychiatrists determine to be mental disorders. It offers a set of diagnostic codes that doctors use, but it's also used as a reference by courts, by insurance companies, and public policy. So it has a kind of authority and importance that's way beyond the clinic. And it also, the other thing I would say about the DSM is that it effectively performs a kind of territorial maneuver for psychiatrists, because when they identify and name aspects of human behavior as illnesses or disorders, they say they're basically declaring them under their legitimate domain. So the first edition of the DSM was published in 1952. It's gone through 5 major revisions since then, so we're on some version of DSM-5 now. And that first edition identified homosexuality and what they called transvestism, alongside pedophilia, fetishism, sadism. They identified them as pathological sexual deviations under a kind of larger category of personality disorders. And so that was the case in the first edition in 1952 and the second in 1968. And it's that inclusion, that formal inclusion of homosexuality in the DSM that identifies homosexuality as a mental disorder that gay activists really start focusing their attention on in the late 60s and in their efforts to really overthrow psychiatric authority and challenge the idea that queerness is a mental disorder.
And can you also talk about during the period of when psychiatry gets a little bit more integrated into mainstream healthcare outside of the roles that we discussed earlier in asylums or state-run facilities, how the Second World War kind of fed into that as a part of doing these screenings for people entering into the military? It almost formalized that as well.
Sure. Well, one of the claims that I make in my book is that psychiatry really relies on its claims to expertise around homosexuality in particular to broker these collaborations with the state, and in the process really expand their power. This is a time when homosexuality is seen as a very serious threat to national security. It's linked to communism. And so, to say we're the experts of this thing is to attract the attention of the U.S. state, right? And so during the Second World War, we see one of those very significant collaborations where psychiatrists, recalling the First World War and what was then known as shell shock and the costs of sort of mental disability after that war, tried to come up with some guidelines to screen out people that they said would be unfit for service. And it's very ironic that homosexuality is included in that in some ways, because one of the main architects of those screening guidelines, Harry Stack Sullivan, was a kind of closeted gay man himself. But they do come up with these screening procedures. Of course, they cast them as very humane,
right,
and progressive. But it also becomes a way for psychiatrists to get the word out to literally millions of people that homosexuality is basically a disqualifying disorder.
Yes, and you can see there how with psychiatry becoming intertwined with the military, and that has lasted throughout. And we're having conversations to this day about trans people being a part of the military, and of course the don't ask, don't tell policy of the Clinton administration. I mean, you can see how these are really, in some ways, the front lines for social control as it relates to gender and sexuality.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, so that's not too harsh to say. I think, like, you know, having criticism, I'm psychiatry and medications, I know they help people, right? But so much of what you write about it's such a it made me think twice about how the field in and of itself constructed and has these systemic flaws.
It does, and of course those flaws were illuminated not just by gay activists, but by, you know, a kind of assortment of activists and scholars who would come under the heading of anti-psychiatry. So this is also a time, you know, and that's a kind of fortuitous moment for gay activists to start this assault on psychiatric authority. Other people are doing it too. You know, other people are pointing this out as well, sometimes in very harsh terms. Right.
Yes. So can you talk a bit about the role of LGBTQ activism in maybe changing and challenging these notions, starting, I guess, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and of course the people, the AIDS crisis, I think, laid bare a lot of medical discrimination against LGBTQ people, obviously. So what was that period like, and how did activists begin to challenge these notions?
Well, these ideas carried so much authority in the culture that for a long time it was hard for gay activists to take them on very directly. And so if we think about homophile activists in the 50s and 60s, are quite deferential to psychiatric authority. These are the people who are telling them that they're sick, but homophile activists are inviting them to their conferences and letting them, you know, publish work in their journals. But beginning in the 60s and especially in the late 60s, gay and lesbian activists really start challenging psychiatry more directly. And starting in about 1970, they start targeting the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association directly, and they turn it into a kind of political stage, you know, to confront psychiatrists. They do that from the audience. They heckle and disrupt sessions. This is, of course, a kind of post-Stonewall movement, and so activist modes are changing. They brought megaphones. They start shouting people down. And eventually they're invited to speak on panels, and so they speak publicly on those panels at the meetings of the APA. Again, they're not the only ones calling out psychiatry. This is a time of broader critique of psychiatry from feminists, from Black activists, from disability activists. And it's also a really turbulent time within the field of psychiatry, because some psychiatrists are starting to challenge the domination of psychoanalysts in the profession. Psychoanalysts had really been ascendant through the 50s and the 60s, and some people are starting to question that, and that's a kind of fortuitous timing thing. So you have gay activists assaulting from beyond, but psychiatrists starting to challenge from within. And then from there, we move to this great showdown in 1973 when the APA meets in Honolulu for the annual conference. And that, of course, is the year that the APA votes to remove homosexuality from the DSM.
And that's 1973, you said?
That's 1973. It's a little complicated because the Board of Trustees of the APA vote in December of 1973 to remove it. That's incredibly shocking and very troubling to many psychiatrists who are opposed to that decision. And so those people demand a referendum of the entire APA membership in an attempt to overturn that. And they got enough signatures on the proposal to force a popular vote So the APA sends a ballot out to its 10,000 members in 1974, and the motion carried the vote of the majority, not an overwhelming majority. 58% of APA members voted to delete homosexuality from the DSM. But that happens, and that happened, we're just now a month plus the 50th anniversary of that moment. That happened in April of 1974.
And can you speak about its endurance as it relates to trans identity? Because we're in a real moment here where there is some exciting medicine in terms of gender affirming care, but of course there's a state crackdown by Republicans, and that there's been some shift, I think, seemingly from American psychiatry. But how did that take its form, and how much further does it need to go?
So the first edition of the DSM to not include homosexuality, and that's the DSM-3 that is published in 1980, is also the first to include the new diagnosis of gender identity disorder that is now listed in the DSM as gender dysphoria. And so this moment that gets celebrated as a great victory for gay rights is also linked, as you point out, with the kind of formal pathologizing of trans people. And so it's a very complicated history, and some would point to a kind of almost a kind of causal relationship between those things. You have gay activists making the case for the exclusion of homosexuality from the DSM, basically saying we're not that, we're not gender deviants,
right?
Right. So that happens in 1980, and as I mentioned, it is still in the DSM. I will say that, when I wrote this book, I sometimes wondered if this particular past might seem antiquated and maybe irrelevant. I confess, anticipate the things that would make this book timely. Sort of the resurgence of pathologizing ideas about queerness that we see in narratives of grooming, that pose the mere existence of queer people in proximity to children as somehow sexualizing those children.
Yep.
And I really didn't anticipate the war on trans life that we're living through right now. There have been 550 anti-trans bills introduced so far in 2024. We're only in May. And the right is really weaponizing that status of gender dysphoria as a formal diagnosis in the DSM. And they are working to restore the authority of psychiatrists as the kind of gatekeepers of transition. And so, this story that so often is told as ending in 1973, we are seeing reverberate now. There is, as I say in the book, there's something. I'm telling the history of something of the stickiness or the adhesiveness of this association between queerness and transness and sickness. I think that really persists today.
I think you're right, and the work is really timely. I'd encourage everybody to check it out. It's called "In the Shadow of Diagnosis: Psychiatric Power and Queer Life." It's beautifully written, and it speaks a bit about your experience, Regina, as well as has a lot of great historical knowledge. And I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for coming on and working through with us with the technology.
Thanks very much.
Have a good day.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you too. Bye.